I'll admit this episode has been the hardest ones I've written on Transcendence so far, and possibly the most difficult one of all of my nearly 3,000 videos. My name is Scott, and I'm writing episode 5 of this mini-series, Transcendence, Our Shared Journey, sitting outside on yet another chilly day on the courtyard of my Airbnb, one of the only places that have Wi-Fi, sipping my coffee, vaping, and asking some big questions. Do most living creatures have, whether by ordained design, natural instinct, or social convention, any real sense of good and bad? And if they do, is that truth even relevant to our own journey of transcendence? I used to think that humans were different from the other species on our planet and that we were the only ones who knew right from wrong, that, for example, if an animal killed another out of instinct, whether it was out of fear or hunger, such an action was neither good or bad because the animal didn't know what good or bad was. But even that premise has faults. After all, many of us still kill other animals for the same reasons, or have a hunter do it for us and a butcher to package the product for us that we buy at the local market. Maybe the more we recognize shared emotional life between species, not just within our own, the more deeply we feel called to care, not just to transcend. Maybe being human doesn't mean we're better, just more accountable. And more to the point, isn't shared stewardship part of our obligation and journey to transcendence? Animals can show empathy, love, curiosity, helpfulness, traits we often think of as uniquely human. But they also show anger, greed, and jealousy, the full range of emotion, really, just like us. We've seen elephants mourn their dead. Dogs show guilt or devotion. Dolphins protect their own. So maybe it's not about knowing good or bad in human terms. Maybe it's about a deeper, shared capacity for relational rightness, whatever form that takes. I'm starting to believe, and I know I'm going on a limb here, that there are some universal truths that all species share, and that we may all have the ability to discern and contemplate our actions if we choose to, and if we have the time to make that choice. Now, I'm not saying that all animals do have the capacity for discernment. I guess I'm asking, do they need it? Maybe a brain isn't even necessary to know right from wrong, but the truth is, we do. Maybe this is just a tangent on my journey to transcendence, but isn't contemplation part of that journey to seek the higher truths? At any rate, it's a nagging feeling I can't completely discount, and if it's true, it has deeper implications for all of us on our shared journey. I hope this thought exercise also helps to show that I'm still working out this path and that there's still so much we all have to learn about the journey. I ask this not to philosophize for its own sake, but to reflect on our own capacity for good and why we so often betray it. Maybe the more urgent question isn't whether other species can know right from wrong, but why, with all our awareness, we so often choose wrong anyway. So, let's narrow the question. Why do we do bad when we have the time and could actually do good? Because if we're honest, most of the time it isn't ignorance. It isn't that we don't know. We usually know exactly what the better choice is. We know the harsh reply will only escalate things. We know that not doing the right thing isn't actually helping us. Knowledge isn't rare. Information isn't scarce. What's scarce is awareness in the moment and choosing wisely. Awareness without reflection is just noise. So what actually happens? Sometimes it's willful ignorance. We sense that looking too closely at something would require us to change, and change costs comfort. So we look away, we distract ourselves, we rationalize. We say later or it's not that serious. Not because we're evil, but because honesty demands effort, and effort is uncomfortable. Sometimes it's bias. We defend our pride, our tribe, our habits, our version of the story, even when the truth is sitting plainly in front of us. We don't choose what's right. We choose what protects our ego. Sometimes it's boredom, and boredom might be one of the quietest dangers of all. When the mind has no direction, it reaches for stimulation, and quick stimulation rarely lifts us upward. It leads to impulse, little hits of dopamine that feel like relief, but slowly hollow us out. Not dramatic sins, not headline-worthy failures, just erosion. And often it's simply habit. We don't choose anything at all. We repeat, but that too is a choice. The same reactions, the same comforts, the same escapes. Like grooves worn into a record, the needle just falls into the same track again and again until we start calling the pattern who we are. That should sound familiar because it's exactly what we talked about in the last episode. Sin survives on repetition. Whatever we feed grows. Whatever we rehearse becomes easier. Enough small compromises become character. Enough character becomes destiny. Most of the bad things we do aren't conscious rebellions against the good. They're automatic behaviors we never stop to question. Not evil, just drift. And drift is powerful because it feels harmless while it slowly carries us somewhere we never intended to go. And here's a practical truth that I struggle with, and maybe you do as well. I don't like denying myself. When I break or try to break bad habits, I have a hard time telling myself that I'll never do something again, so I hedge. I may not do the same sin or habit as often, but I don't make promises to myself that I know I'll have a hard time keeping and that which feels like I'm giving up some freedom or some pleasure. But isn't the journey to transcendence and ascension a higher freedom and pleasure? Maybe that's where the contradiction lives. We want to be free, but we also want to indulge. We want to ascend, but we don't want to let go of what's keeping us grounded. And so we hover, not quite rising, not quite falling, repeating patterns that feel like autonomy, but often serve as our chains. But transcendence is freedom. Not the kind that lets us do whatever we want, but the kind that frees us from being ruled by what we want in the moment. It's the quiet freedom of not being pulled by every craving, every ego flare, every impulse dressed up as need. It's the freedom of not being mastered by our appetites. And it can be pleasure too, a deeper kind, not the spike of dopamine, but the warmth of alignment, the pleasure of living in integrity, the clarity of a clean conscience, the calm that comes when your actions finally match your intentions. It's not as loud as indulgence, but it lasts longer, and it builds something rather than empties you out. What greater joy is there than being good, letting our inner light guide us, and living whole, in alignment with what's true? Isn't that both a gift and a responsibility we all share? But why be good? Why seek alignment? Why long for union with God or ascend toward enlightenment? Because at some point, whether through suffering, silence, or sudden clarity, we recognize that the pleasures we chase cannot satisfy the ache we carry, the ache to live without shame, to love without pretending, to be without fracturing ourselves into roles and masks, to truly belong. Goodness, then, isn't about following rules. It's about healing that fracture, about remembering who we are when we stop running. From a Catholic perspective, to be good is to return to the image of God we were made in, to live as His children, free and beloved, responding to His grace with our whole heart. It is joy not as fleeting emotion, but as the fruit of belonging, to God, to truth, to the communion of others walking the same path. For within, there is a greater joy than one can realize from without. Maybe that's the true purpose and gift that awaits us. It's about returning to a wholeness we can never fully reach when we live in sin without salvation. It's not just about hearing that little voice, our conscience, but about becoming it, living in harmony with it. Because that voice, when rightly formed, carries not just our own yearning for goodness, but the wisdom God breathes into the soul. Life, then, is not a race toward perfection, but a refining, a cleansing of what clouds the image of the Creator within us. Alignment isn't about control, it's about healing. And in that healing, we begin to remember who we truly are. Even for those outside of faith, the desire to be good still emerges, not from guilt, but from longing. Longing to be whole, longing to matter, longing to feel peace, not just about your life, but within it. When we live aligned, when our actions match our values, when we choose compassion over impulse, we quiet the war within us. We stop splitting ourselves, and in that integrity, that inner coherence, there is joy. Not the thrill of indulgence, but the radiance of meaning. Ultimately, we seek transcendence not to escape the world, but to become more fully alive within it, to rise above the noise, yes, but also to live so truthfully that nothing within us needs to hide. That is what it means to be good, and that, whatever your path, is joy worth seeking. Discernment is the moment we stop drifting and start choosing. That tension between the higher freedom of transcendence and the quick fix of comfort is where most of our choices live, and it's in that very space that discernment becomes essential. That's where discernment enters the picture. Discernment is simply the pause between impulse and action. It's the ability to stop for a breath and ask, why am I about to do this? What is this really serving? It interrupts autopilot. It creates a small space where choice can actually happen. Without that pause, we're just reacting, and reaction looks a lot like instinct. With that pause, we become intentional. We become responsible. Contemplation goes deeper. If discernment is the momentary pause, contemplation is the longer practice of stepping back and studying our lives with honesty. It's looking for patterns. It's asking what keeps pulling us off course. It's noticing which habits leave us lighter and which leave us heavier. It's not self-criticism, it's clarity. And clarity quietly dissolves things that force never could. This is also where time matters. We animals usually act on immediacy, stimulus, and response. But when we have the time, we're afforded the luxury and choice to think. Time to imagine consequences. Time to consider someone else's feelings. Time to choose compassion over convenience. Time is the space where morality happens. Without time, there's only reaction. With time, there's responsibility. That's the burden, and the gift of being alive. Simply having time, though, isn't enough. We waste it constantly. Time without discernment becomes distraction. Time without contemplation becomes avoidance. But time used well becomes transformation. So how do we actually practice this? Not in grand, heroic gestures, but in small, repeatable ways. Build pauses into your day. Before responding to anything emotional, wait a few seconds and breathe. Most poor decisions lose their power if you don't act immediately. Many of us are great at procrastination. Maybe procrastination can be a gift if we use it the right way, to slow down bad actions until we're able to think clearer, or at least until we've chosen another course, or until we get distracted with something else. Ah, the games we play. Here's a thought. Name your impulses instead of obeying them. I want to lash out. I want to avoid this. I'm just bored. Naming something separates you from it. Ask simple questions before acting. Is this true? Is this necessary? Is this kind? If the answer is no, step back. Replace. Don't just resist. If you remove a destructive habit, fill that space with something better. Movement, prayer, reading, conversation, service, creation, because emptiness invites the old pattern back. And reflect regularly. At the end of the day, quietly ask where you drifted and where you chose well. Not to shame yourself, just to notice. Awareness compounds. Small corrections add up. So why do we do bad when we have the time and could do good? Not because we're monsters, not because we're doomed. Usually because we're distracted, biased, habit-bound, or afraid. Because we never slowed down long enough to choose. Transcendence isn't about becoming perfect. It's about becoming conscious. It's about shrinking the distance between knowing and doing. It's about using the time we've been given to act deliberately rather than automatically. Choice is still the foundation, just like we said in episode 3. But discernment and contemplation are what make that choice visible. Without them, we don't really choose at all. So maybe the real practice is simple. When you reach a fork in the road, and there are dozens every day, pause. Notice. Choose the path that leads toward light instead of comfort. Do that often enough, and the higher road stops feeling exceptional. It just becomes who you are. And maybe that's what transcendence really is. Not escape, not perfection, just a life lived awake, one small, deliberate choice at a time. In episode 6, we'll look at how forgiveness, especially forgiving yourself, becomes the bridge between stumbling and continuing the journey. Until then, let me know in the comments, how do you build discernment in your own life? And when have you ignored it and learned something from the silence that followed? So, if we know the better path and still stray, what's one thing we can do in that moment when the temptation to choose poorly creeps in? Here's one simple task, a small reminder that holds weight across ethics, philosophy, and psychology alike. Ask yourself, who do I become if I do this, and who do I become if I don't? And tell yourself, do good in all things great and small, and ask yourself, does this serve yourself and the wider world, what I call the commons? It's a question that slows the rush. It returns you to yourself. It invites you to imagine not just the action, but the becoming, the slow shaping of your soul. That's not about shame or pride. It's about integrity. Because in that pause, you're no longer just reacting, you're remembering. And every time you remember who you want to be, you take one step away from drift and one step closer to transcendence. So here's my question for you to share in the comments. What's one decision, one small choice that helped you feel more aligned with the person you're trying to become? Whether it was quiet or difficult, personal or public, those moments matter, and sharing them may help someone else recognize their own. And with that, I continue to walk. I walk with questions that don't always have answers, but with the trust that asking them still matters. I walk in the chill of another quiet Albanian morning, where coffee cools slowly, thoughts settle gradually, and the signal of the inner life is just strong enough to follow, if we listen. I walk not as someone who has figured this out, but as someone learning in real time, just like you. Because when we ask whether there's some universal sense of right and wrong, holiness and harm, goodness and grief, whether it's written in our biology or whispered through grace, we're not just asking for moral certainty. We're contemplating the nature of the universe, and by doing so, we're giving our time to something higher. And that means giving less time to lesser pursuits, like we talked about in the last episode. The fire fades when we stop feeding it. We'll keep exploring that in episodes to come. We're not alone in our struggles. Maybe the gift and burden of discernment is that whichever species has the ability like us to pause at the fork, we still sometimes choose poorly, but we can also choose again. And if that universal knowing does exist, maybe it offers us two things at once. Conviction when we're tempted to abandon the good, and solace when we're too tired to reach it. You're not alone in wrestling with that. I'm not either. These questions of how to live, how to choose, how to stay awake in a world that rewards numbness, they belong to all of us. And so, our shared journey continues. Until next time,